Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, executive editor of TNSR. Ronald Reagan is often venerated today as one of our greatest contemporary presidents, but it's easy to forget that during his term, he was often a focus of criticism from both the left and the right. On the left, many feared that he was a warmonger who might lead the United States into nuclear war, while on the right, many feared that his overtures to Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev were in fact giving away the important elements and placing America at greater risk. In addition, his controversial term included a buildup of American military power, where he could be said to have stared down the evil empire of the Soviet Union, as well as the Iran-Contra scandal, a gross abuse of government power that offered aid to the very Iranian regime whose abduction of American hostages had in part enabled Reagan's election in 1980, as well as support to oppressive regimes in Central America and elsewhere. Texas National Security Review editor-in-chief and University of Texas professor Will Inboden has just completed a comprehensive biography of Reagan entitled The Peacemaker. In this episode of Horns, Inboden sits down with Frank Gavin, chair of the TNSR editorial board, and discusses his new book. On a personal note, I particularly enjoyed this conversation. This podcast is being released right after the American Thanksgiving holiday, where political discussion is stereotypically a part of what happens at the dinner table. I suspect that many Horns of a Dilemma listeners may be frustrated by discussions with relatives or friends whose views seem to be more formed than informed. One of the things I really value about this particular episode is the thoughtful, respectful, and engaging discussion of one scholar with another, done with obvious affection for each other and respect for their views. This reminds me that one of the things I am thankful for is to be a part of the TNSR family and to be a part of a broader security studies community that seeks to bring thoughtful analysis to pressing questions. I hope that you've enjoyed a great Thanksgiving weekend, and I hope that you enjoy this episode.
I know you've been working on this project for so long, and it came out beautifully. And there's about a billion different questions I want to ask. And I think you know what question I'm going to ask, because as you know, I love how you start the book, and you start with this extraordinary moment with President Reagan talking at Westminster about what he sees as the fact that he believes that the Cold War will work out in a positive direction, that democracy, the forces of freedom will prevail in the long term. And what's so remarkable about this description that you give is that it's not a particularly warm setting, and it's also a time where the Western alliance is not exactly at its best form. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that moment and about how that starts the book off, and what that sort of how that helps us understand Reagan and his foreign policy.
Sure, thank you, and of course I owe a lot of thanks to you and Jim Steinberg for suggesting that would be a great framing device to start the book, and you're absolutely right. And what I'm trying to do in starting the book that way, and with a lot of themes in the book, is restoring contingency to history. Right? Reagan is in some ways looms as this almost mythical figure in the past. Now, obviously, there's a lot of iconography around him, and we'll talk. Obviously, my book is overall a pretty favorable assessment. But what I wanted to do is re-anchor his speeches, his ideas in the context of the time, and show that even though we know now, looking back, that history turned out pretty well, it was not very evident at the time that it would. And some of these ideas, that he's putting across in the speech, some of the things he's trying to do as he's developing his strategies were very contested, very controversial, and it did not necessarily seem that the tides of history were swimming in that favor. So just with the Westminster Address from June of 1982, this is, of course, the famous one where he says that Marxism-Leninism will end up on the ash heap of history, and talks about the forward march of freedom. He arrives in London in a very perilous spot in his presidency. The British ambassador to Washington has been observing him keenly, cables Margaret Thatcher, the prime minister, and says Reagan is effectively a lame duck. He's almost certainly going to be a one-term president. His approval ratings are lower than Jimmy Carter at the time, right? And, in just 18 months, that's quite a plummet. The American economy is still a mess. The British economy is still a mess. It seems that the Soviets are still ascendant in the Cold War. And then everywhere else House, the world is aflame. Just a couple of days earlier, Israel had invaded Lebanon, and so incredible turmoil in the Middle East. Just 2 or 3 months earlier, Argentina had invaded or recaptured the Falklands Islands, a British territory in the South Atlantic, caused a huge rift between Reagan and Thatcher. She felt like Reagan and the Americans were not with her, and in fact, they weren't with her initially. And so, for him to be appearing here at Westminster, there's a lot of resentment among the British political class, especially his good friend Thatcher. And meanwhile, on the British left, the Labour Party, most of the Labour MPs boycott his speech. They don't even want to be there for it. There's over 100,000 protesters in Hyde Park denouncing him as a nuclear warmonger. So this is it appears to be a weak, embattled, imperiled president with, in his own cabinet is feuding at home. And he goes and gives this incredibly audacious speech. And in hindsight, a lot of the things he's laying out in the speech do turn out well, but it does not appear to very many people at all at the time. And that's what I mean about just restoring that context to the history.
That's absolutely terrific. And you brought up a theme, and I'd love to hear more about it because I think it's so important. Something you and I have talked about, this sort of outcome or retrospective bias, this assumption that, well, things turned out the way they were supposed to turn out. And you in the book amazingly capture contingency. What if you could tell me a little bit more about that? I had two kind of fun thought experiments, and you can play with them if you want. One was if Reagan had won in 76 against Ford, and as you know, it was a very, very close thing.
Yeah, the last contested political convention in American history.
And an amazing sort of story, and it comes very close. And then and this one might be a little spicier, but I kept wondering, what if there had been a third Reagan term, right? Because obviously the foundations for the end of the Cold War are set in the Reagan administration. And as we know, the George H.W. Bush administration, the 41 administration, even though it was Republican, even though he had been vice president, they took a very different view of these things. And so those were the two examples that came to mind. But, maybe there are alternative scenarios you thought about when you were thinking about context, when you were thinking about contingency, when you were thinking about trying to recapture that sense of choice and how it mattered. You can go whatever direction you want with this, but sort of maybe you could give us some examples where you saw that contingency really playing it out, where things could have been different, where the choices where Reagan made were absolutely kind of essential.
Yeah, no, I'm a sucker for counterfactuals, and you and I both know how risky they can be. But at the same time, I do find them a helpful device to tease out, where does individual leadership make a difference? Where is it about the particular circumstances and tides of history? So, and we won't chase this one down, but another one has been if John Hinckley's bullet was another millimeter to the right or left, and Reagan would have died in March of '81, and George H.W. Bush would have ascended to the presidency, I guess 7.5 years earlier than he actually did. So I'll take the two that you mentioned, with all the caveats of this is just speculation. I think if Reagan won the nomination in 1976, the Republican nomination, he likely would have also won the presidency. Because you look at how close Ford came to defeating Carter, just within a few thousand votes in a couple of states, and a lot of what dragged Ford down, of course, had been the pardon of Nixon, the stench of Watergate, and Reagan wouldn't have had that. Don't know this for sure. Maybe Reagan's more aggressive conservatism would not have appealed to crossover voters, but I have to say, if he actually had become president in 76 and tried to push the policy he did, I don't know that the time would have been right for them. I don't know that the country would have been ready, politically, economically, to do the defense buildup and modernization. I don't know that, kind of the conditions of stagflation had run their course enough yet for, Reaganomics to come in and juice the economy. I don't know that détente had fully run its course yet, even with, U.S.-Soviet relations, where the time would have been there to start pushing more. The Soviet Union, we can see in hindsight, was probably fairly, somewhat brittle in 76, but certainly nothing like it was by 81, 82. So again, too many paths there. I don't want to go too far with it, but I could have seen politically him winning, and yet it not being the right time for these policies to succeed. And then, a third term. This is in some ways an even harder one, because a lot of people who voted for Vice President Bush in '88 kind of thought they were voting for a third Reagan term, politically. And as as much as they had a cordial partnership, Bush was very different, a very different disposition, very different conviction, brings an entirely new team in, right? I mean, George Shultz, even when I interviewed him for this book many, many years later, was still bitter that he was never invited back into the State Department during the 4 years of Jim Baker as Secretary of State and that kind of stuff. And I'm not sure how well Reagan would have been able to manage the crack up of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Iron Curtain. Obviously, he put so many of those forces in play for that, and so I think his strengths were that more disruptive strategic vision. Whereas, the management of things like German reunification, the management of the Gulf War, for all of Reagan's strategic vision and deft diplomatic skills, he wasn't a great manager. And whereas Bush and his team were better managers. So I'm not trying to take anything away, but I think Reagan's accomplishments, which are legion, and I try to lay them out in the book over these 8 years, they are also well suited to world conditions in those 8 years. And had he come along sooner, or had he stayed a little later, might not have been as good of a match. So, and I would actually, I'd actually welcome some of your thoughts on this too. You're good at putting some of the questions, but would you play those out any differently?
Well, I think it's really interesting, and your point about I want to get to both the strategic vision issue and the management issue in a second, but I have always been struck by what a different approach the George H.W. administration took, and how they basically early on put a freeze on much of what Reagan had put into place, and did their own strategic review, and had people who thought that the Reagan people may have been being naive about Gorbachev and being duped and wanted their own answers. And I've heard, and I want to get to this, I've heard you talk about very eloquently about the sort of values versus interest chain, and how in a lot of ways in the Republican Party, Reagan was a move away from the kind of Nixon Kissinger, and this might have been the sort of pull back to that. So I think it's very interesting. I obviously it's unanswerable, but one wonders if, given all the whether one of the things that's striking from your book is how Reagan had really seen through Gorbachev a partner, right? And you get the idea of the Bush administration, it wasn't necessarily seen that way early on, and then events kind of went out, unfolded in a certain way. And that gets actually to a question, because I do want to get to the strategic vision and the management thing. But, as I was reading the book, I was thinking, Reagan is such a unique, powerful historical character. And what is your is it fair to say that he's more polarizing than most presidents? And maybe he's not, but as I was thinking back to the time. Sadly, I'm old enough to remember, and there were people on the foreign policy front who thought he was this transformative figure, and there were others who thought it was going to lead to World War III, right? He generated enormous passions. And looking back on it, we see it like, well, he seems wise, but that wasn't how it felt. Like a big states gamble. And was there, when you think about Reagan, is it fair to say he was polarizing? Why do you think he generated such passions, both for and against?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And first, I want to say you're absolutely right about the polarization. And I was in junior high and high school during these years, so I was not terribly politically aware, but I was following this stuff some. And I for readers who pick up the book, look in the photo section, and I include in there a negative anti-Reagan propaganda poster from 1984. That I hung on my bedroom wall when I was in junior high and high school, because I thought he was a deranged warmonger and was going to, plunge the world into nuclear war. I was, rather uninformed, but I was picking up a lot of ideas that my high school teachers had, that some of my parents' friends had, that some of his media critics had. And in researching the book, I went back and found a lot of contemporaneous op-eds by senior foreign policy figures really denouncing him. A really interesting article in Foreign Affairs by a couple of prominent Sovietologists in 1982, just saying his policies will never work. dark, they're incredibly reckless, they're deluded. So he generated very strong passions, both at the elite level as well as with his political opponents. But he had that charisma. He was, he was called the great communicator. Some meant it as, somewhat damning with faint praise. But I think it was very genuine. It was look back and see his speeches, and over time, he does start to win over a critical mass of the American people, right? So his 1984 reelection, wins 49 states, landslide, carries every state except for Minnesota and District of Columbia, if I remember right. Mm-hmm. And so there was a sense among a large swath of the American middle of like, we may have been more skeptical of this guy before, but we're coming around to him. It seems like some of these policies are working. But interestingly, and I trace this out in the book, in his second term, even as he overall enjoys pretty high approval ratings, a dip during the Iran-Contra, and we can come back to that, he starts to generate new rounds of fierce and vocal opposition when he is embracing Gorbachev and working with Gorbachev from his own conservative base. And you've got a number of, conservative Republican senators and House members who are thinking, this guy's being fleeced by these Soviets. He's giving away the farm. We should not do, Jesse Helms, Dan Quayle, Malcolm Wallop. They're all fiercely opposed to the INF treaty. The conservative columnist George Will, who had been a really big Reagan fan, writes a number of searing columns saying, he is giving away the farm to Gorbachev. We're going to lose the Cold War. I've talked to George Will about this more recently, and he chuckles at it. And he admits that he got it wrong, but he says he was terrified that Reagan was given up. Bill Buckley, William F. Buckley Jr., a longtime close friend of Reagan's, has a very bracing exchange of letters with Reagan saying, I really worry that you've gone weak, you've gone soft here. And so there never was a moment in the entire 8 years of his presidency where Reagan wasn't inspiring strong criticism from somewhere, which again makes all the more remarkable that he had that resolve, that equanimity to stay the course with the policies that he believed in.
Yeah, that's really, really remarkable. That's because again, as the question I was thinking about Democrats who were so polarized, but you're absolutely right. Towards the end there, Republicans, and you think about issues like immigration too, where and so much, so many aspects of the modern Republican Party were elements that we see today that Reagan was probably pushing against. And I would. It's another thing I would love to. I know it's not the focus of the book, but thinking about the Republican Party today and Reagan's Republican Party. But you mentioned, and this is clear in the book, about this strategic vision. And this being a TNSR podcast, one of our probably most cited articles is Rebecca Listener's piece on grand strategy, right? Mm-hmm. And so, you were in the White House actually helping to devise grand strategy, right? The national security strategy in the second George W. Bush term. I wonder, because I want to get to what you thought Reagan's strategic vision was, but did your thoughts about grand strategy change as you worked on Reagan? Meaning, we know there's a big dispute. There's some people who argue, sometimes persuasively, there's no such thing as grand strategy. There's others say, oh, it's absolutely a thing. But where do you find it? How did your sort of, as you were trying to, because you lay out a very clear and compelling strategic vision, how did your thinking about grand strategy itself change as you were wrestling with Reagan's strategic vision?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I'll try to give, start with the bottom line up front to anchor this, and then I'll reflect on it a little bit more. I came away with, at least in this circumstance, with the Reagan administration in the 1980s, late part of the Cold War, more of an appreciation for the craft and the possibility of a grand strategy. And I had not gone into the book, entirely skeptical of such things being possible. My thinking has evolved in this, but for anyone working in high levels of government, it's always going to be some blend of strategy and improvisation, right? I mean, there's never, a pure archetype of only one or only the other. But at least in this particular era and with this presidency, I moved more towards, there was a clear strategic vision. It was articulated, and there was an effort to align ways, means, and ends. And I'll talk through some of the details there. The other caveat, though, is for scholars, now that I'm in my second life as a scholar, there's always the risk of trying to retrospectively impose more order and clarity on something than was actually there at the time. And again, it is clear that for Reagan and his team, and this comes out in the archives, comes out in the interviews, there is some element of, all right, we're feeling our way forward. We're in a terrifying, uncertain world here. We're going to have to adapt and change a little bit. There's certainly some of that. But with those caveats, why I came away seeing a much more clear grand strategy and seeing, at least in this context, it was possible is from the outset, 81, 82, 83, when Reagan and his team are putting together their two main strategy documents, NSDD 32 and NSDD 75, for any of the wonks listening who care about the detail they see. And they're both declassified now. You can find them on the web. Really interesting to read. But not just reading those strategy documents themselves, but reading the thousands of pages of white papers and working papers and memos and task force projects behind those. And then reading the transcripts of the NSC meetings that Reagan chaired as they were refining these, a few things came out. One, Reagan does have a strategic end goal in mind of a negotiated surrender of the Soviet Union, that he wants both goals of defeating Soviet communism as a system and as an idea, but also negotiating with the Soviet authorities for reducing nuclear weapons and bringing the Cold War to a peaceful end. And then another part that's absolutely clear is pressuring the Soviet system to produce a reformist leader. This is where Reagan is influenced quite a bit by Dick Pipes, the famous, eminent Harvard Russia historian, Sovietologist, who does a 2-year stint on his NSC staff. And Pipes points out to Reagan, even going back into Russian history, pre-Soviet history, these cycles of, reform movements when the regime is becoming a little more sclerotic, and is hopeful that one can emerge in the Soviet system, but it needs more pressure. The contradictions need to be exposed, the weaknesses need to be exploited. And yet, because Reagan wants to keep the Cold War cold and avoid it, turning into a hot nuclear war, he also wants a negotiating partner. And so it's seen that intentionality. And even the time frame. April 1982, to get into the specifics, Reagan is chairing an NSC meeting to review and approve the final draft of one of these strategies. And they're going through, here's the military dimension of it, here's the economic dimension of it, here's the role of allies, here's the role of political warfare. So it's using all elements of national power, another important component of grand strategy. And then time frame, they say, we think the next decade is critical, and we think that we are on the verge of seeing profound changes in the Soviet system and in East-West relations. Parsing it out, December of 1991 is when the Soviet Union dissolves. They said, we think the next 10 years, right? They're off by 3 months, right? I mean, to be cheeky about it. Yeah. So I just found more intentionality about the end goals that actually happened. A reformist Soviet leader emerging, the demise of Soviet communism, negotiations to reduce nuclear weapons, and a peaceful victory in the Cold War. And so that's why I think, wow, they come up with a strategic vision, they come up with the end goals, and then he tries to align all elements of national power towards that. It's a textbook definition of grand strategy.
That's really remarkable. And I think really one of the remarkable parts of it is this assessment of these things that are going to happen. And again, going back to contemporary times, one of the reasons I think, and you highlighted this, he's so polarizing, is this was not elite public opinion, right? Mm-hmm. If you picked up the Washington Post, the New York Times in 1981, 82, or if you were an audience, a member in the Westminster speech, mm-hmm. your assumption was not that the Soviet Union was on the ropes, quite the contrary. And could you tell us a little bit about both how Reagan himself, but also the administration, came to see that opportunity, that mm-hmm. this was not in the same way that 10 years earlier that you could make a case that Nixon and Kissinger said, this is not the time to make aggressive moves. Mm-hmm. We need stability because of the position, the correlation of forces, as the Marxists used to say. Mm-hmm. What was it? What were the factors that led him and his administration to think that this was the propitious time and that this is what was happening?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because exactly as you point out, most conventional wisdom, most expert opinion, right, at the time was that the Soviet Union was durable, stable, reasonably strong, sure, inefficient and, not the perfect system, but wasn't going anywhere, was going to be a semi-permanent part of the geopolitical landscape. And that was not an implausible thing to think. I mean, if I were paying attention or an expert at the time, I probably would have thought that too. It had been around for decades at that point, and we were not seeing any early signs of demise. But for Reagan, I think it's a few things. One, it does start out of his philosophical and religious convictions, almost as an article of faith, which is that what he knew of communism, both as a command economy, its atheist dogmas, its totalitarian control of its people, it just seemed fundamentally unnatural to him. It just seemed like there is something about this that is so contrary to the human spirit, that is so contrary to what a good and prosperous society can look like, that it just can't go on. Okay. Now, if that's all you have, that's not enough, because, well, okay, you may have those commitments, but then there's reality, which is there's the Kremlin, and it's strong, and it's got a potent military and a large economy, and spans 11 time zones, so on and so forth. But because Reagan had this belief that system couldn't continue, he was more open to signs of evidence that it wasn't going to continue, right? And so signs of evidence that maybe other experts who didn't share those commitments would not have seen. So he was fascinated by the plight of Soviet dissidents. And anytime one would be released from prison or exiled to the West, he'd want to meet with them in the White House. And it wouldn't just be, oh, tell me how you endured in prison. It would be, tell me what the Russian people think. What do they think of their government? Do you have hopes for a better life? Is your family happy there? And he's over and over hearing from them, the bread lines are really long, and we hate our government. And we're tired of the KGB, the knocks on the door at midnight, and we're tired of the corruption, and none of us really believe in the ideology anymore. And so, rather than paying attention to whatever bogus GDP figures that Kremlin was producing, he's listening to these real life accounts of people. And then another really interesting source comes to him, actually via Andy Marshall in the Office of Net Assessment. And Marshall had been skeptical a few years early of official Soviet growth figures too. Like, wait a minute, they just can't be having this, the economy of this particular scale. But he wasn't seeing enough good analysis coming out of CIA at the time. And of course, our mutual friend Mark Trachtenberg, we have some differences on this. I think he's a little more favorable to CIA assessments. But here's the key thing. Marshall then gets to know some Soviet emigre economists. So there's a few of these kind of renegade Soviet economists who've been exiled from the Soviet Union, and they set up this kind of think tank in Rockville, Maryland, running out of an attic or something like this. I'm giving a little color to this, essentially. And so these guys are trained economists, but are coming out of the Soviet system, and they're producing studies for anyone who listens, saying this economy is a wreck, right? It's not spending 15% of its GDP on the military; it's about 50%. Okay, and the GDP is not X billion, it's half of that. And you can't trust any of the numbers coming out. And so Marshall starts sending some of the reports from these, Soviet emigre economists over to the White House, saying, President Reagan, you got to read these too. And so he's becoming his own intelligence officer in some ways. And one of the things that I realize now in hindsight was significant is when Reagan decided to lift the American grain embargo on the Soviet Union. So again, Carter had imposed it after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, meaning American farmers couldn't sell grain to the Soviet Union. The Soviets wanted it lifted. And Reagan does lift it as a goodwill gesture. Partly because American farmers were, running out of money and, not able to export the grain. But he realized, wait a minute, Soviet Union is the largest landmass in the world. It has millions and millions of acres of rich farmland, and it can't feed its own people. Yeah. What kind of system is this? So just at that basic common sense, intuitive level, like, wait a minute, something is not adding up here. So all those things come together for him to think, I think this system is more brittle and more vulnerable than the experts are telling me, and I want to push it and see how far we can take it.
So that's really that's really interesting. And as I was thinking, as you're saying that, how did Reagan think about? So there's this opportunity, but you're also in a nuclear world, and we'll talk in a moment, hopefully, about how Reagan thought about nuclear weapons. But between pressure and stability, right? Between the idea that here's this opportunity, that certain aspects of the grand strategy are going to expose the weaknesses of the system. But at the same time, this is a nuclear world. This is a regime that can be dangerous. And again, I guess this is the basic question of risk profile, because this was the kind of thing that people would accuse him of back in the day. How did he think about how to balance between these opportunities to pressure in an Andy Marshall kind of way and the concerns that things like leading up, and maybe talking about the year 1983 when these pressures, when it seems, people often talk about that being the year of kind of maximum danger.
Yeah.
How did he calibrate that?
Yeah, it was a very difficult balance, and I think I would put it that in Reagan's mind, what he was doing is pressure and outreach, or pressure and reassurance, and we can look back now and see that helped preserve a certain amount of stability, only in terms of the world didn't go up in a mushroom cloud of nuclear destruction, but I don't see as much deliberate concern on Reagan's part for maintaining the stability, because he associated stability with détente, which had been something the Soviets had exploited. And so let's be honest. I mean, the policies he's pushing are destabilizing, right? And so he is taking on significantly increased risk. Now it's part of a broader grand design. This is not risk for risk's sake. It's right. I don't think it's as reckless as his critics accused him. But his way of managing risk, rather than trying to do other, if you will, maybe kind of stabilizing, policies and trying to think of what those look like, is to pretty regularly be messaging the Soviets, I want to talk to you. I'm not going to launch a first strike. I don't want to blow you up in nuclear war. I'm terrified of nuclear weapons too. Let's have a dialogue. Let's get to know each other. Let's build some trust. And part of that he's doing is genuine, that he wants to have a negotiating partner. He's very eager to meet with a Soviet leader. He's, fascinated by them, even as he's trying to defeat them. But also, he knows that his rhetoric and buildup are going to be provocative and destabilizing to them. And so he's trying to send as many signals as he can of, I am not out to start a nuclear war, and don't misinterpret this. And even though the Soviets aren't very responsive initially, I mean, no, Brezhnev will roll right back to his letters with his own fulmination things. Some of the channels of communication are there. I think and hope, this is a little more speculative, that those may have played some role. I mean, here's in the Soviets not lashing out even more. And here's a vivid example. Of course, you're aware, and a number of our listeners will be aware of that terrifying moment of September of '83 when Colonel Petrov, the Russian army colonel, watching the radar station at midnight, and there's the false alarm, thinking, the Americans have launched, right? But then he decides, he's only got a 5-minute window. I'm glossing over this, but a 5-minute window to decide, do I wake up at drop of and say we need to launch a counterstrike, or no, I think it's a false alarm. Well, why did he think that? It's because he had a certain intuitive faith the Americans wouldn't do this to us. I know that there are enemies, but they're not going to try to destroy the world in nuclear war. And what he didn't realize, I don't think he would have heard it yet, is just a few hours earlier, Reagan had gone before the UN General Assembly and for the first time said, a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Mm-hmm. And he repeated that many, many, many times. But so there was something about, even in the mid-level ranks of the Soviet military, as well as the more senior echelons of the Kremlin, so much as they also saw the Americans as adversaries and didn't like Reagan at all, the Americans aren't going to try to blow up the world. And even when there's that crucible moment of actually maybe they did launch, and kind of making that gut call, no, they didn't, and I'm going to treat this as a false alarm. So I think that episode it speaks volumes about the larger strategic picture. That's great. That's really interesting. So this captures a couple other puzzles that I wanted to ask you about. One is, because it seems to me there's the book highlights two really big thrusts of this strategic vision. One is this democratization of freedom, mm-hmm. Which is important. I want to get to that. But the other is and I've heard you discuss this as military modernization, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the things that's so interesting, this gets to '83, it gets to the Petrov incident, is that it's not that just that the U.S. Increases significantly its defense expenditures. It's what it spends it on, right? Yeah. And it actually spends a lot of money on nuclear modernization, counterforce capabilities, command control communications and intelligence. Mm-hmm. There's other things like sea lift in the Navy and all that kind of stuff. But it's very particular sort of, and then SDI, of course,
while at the same time, Reagan hates nuclear weapons, right? And there's this tension there.
Yeah.
Wait, could you help us understand that a little more?
Yeah. The best I can do is try to explain what I think is what Reagan's intentions were and what he's trying to do. And again, as you said, it's intention. It's build up to build down, right? I mean, so his ultimate goal is abolishing all nuclear weapons. He wants to see a completely nuclear-free world. He's terrified of them. But he also sees the biggest risk to the world is not just the mere existence of nuclear weapons. It's nuclear weapons in the hands of the Soviet communism. And so that's why for him, mere unilateral disarmament wouldn't be enough. You've got to make sure that the wicked system controlling and manufacturing and deploying these weapons is gone as well. And so there's a certain and in turn that leads to the strategic logic of, right, well, the best way to put pressure on that system which controls those weapons is us building up our own weapons to deter their use of force, of course, to put more pressure on them. But then also as that instrument of the ultimate diplomatic goal of negotiations with the Soviets and reducing and eventually eliminating all nuclear weapons. And so one can trace out the internal logic of it. And I actually think it is quite plausible. And that's how it works out in practice, right? I mean, Reagan announces he wants the zero option for INF, eliminating, the Soviets get rid of all their SS-20s in Eastern Europe and the U.S. won't deploy. He announces that sometime in the fall of 1981. And gets nowhere with the Soviets over the next couple of years on the negotiations. Paulnitz's walk in the woods notwithstanding, right? And it's not until Reagan then says, fine, we're going to go forward with the deployment. And in November of 83, deploys our Pershing IIs and Gluckams there in Eastern Europe. And, the Soviets, Gorbachev later says, that's like a pistol pointed at our head. And so he had to actually, pull the metaphorical gun out of the holster, point it at the Soviets, do that build up to then bring them back to the negotiating table. And that 4 years later, almost to the day, from that deployment to the signing of the INF Treaty in December of 87, it works. And so that's a smaller example of what his larger goal was of that build up to build down. But then you can also say in practice, okay, this still meant, the United States wielding, even more and more advanced, levels of these really, really terrifying weapons as the Soviets were doing it too. But Reagan's, a lot of his critics missed that. They only focused on, he's trying to put the MX out there and he's expanded the arsenal and he's threatening nuclear war. And if they would have paid a little more attention, they would have seen this guy's even more afraid of nuclear war than you are. He just has a different way of how he wants to get there to preventing it.
Well, it is interesting because you're right. Because again, this is one of those, this is on my mind because I was at an event for Susie Colburn's terrific book on Euro missiles, which just came out, which vividly and captures all of this. And Reagan, despite the fact that kind of in elite circles, people were very concerned about this and the protests and the nuclear freeze movement and the Catholic bishops and a variety of all the protests to the deployment of the Pershing IIs in Europe, that Reagan is right on the sort of public aspect of it. And there's something about him, because it's another interesting thing that comes through in the book. There's in 83, things seem dangerous. He gets this pressure, but he's able then to kind of to put it in a way that doesn't so terrify publics that he loses an election or loses or undermines alliance support for this, which is, I think, an aspect of his political skill in foreign policy that if you were actually to say, what is something people would in our world would say, 41, George H.W. Bush was far more of a master of foreign policy. But in some ways, it's far harder to be changing the risk profile in a highly charged set of democracies and not just win the day on the policy, but win at the ballot box. So how is intuitive feel for the politics of this? Is that something that?
No, it's a great point. And this is where, an underappreciated aspect of Reagan is his alliance management. I mean, just in general, but I want to come back to this very specifically on the politics of it and on the nuclear question. But one of the thread you mentioned on how he's dealing with public opinion in the protests, right after he gives that Westminster speech in London in June of 82, he then travels to Bonn and to West Berlin. And he gives another speech in West Berlin. It's his second time seeing the wall, and he denounces it again. And of course, there's couple 100,000 anti-Reagan, anti-nuclear protesters. And he directly engages with them in the speech. He says to one of them, "I know there's many protesters out there, and I saw one of you holding up a sign that says, 'I am afraid.'" And he says, "I am afraid too." And he said, "I want you to know that I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, but I understand that. I feel that myself. I'm trying to get us to a better place where we won't have to be afraid. And we may differ on the policies, but again, and I don't know if that changed the mind of the protester or not, right? But it's a powerful moment. But meanwhile, so the protesters are not just protesting against Reagan; they're protesting against their own governments. Right. Helmut Kohl's government in West Germany. I can't remember the Italian prime minister's name, but one of their 150 prime ministers, whoever it was at the time. The Dutch, of course, Thatcher in the UK. Essentially,
Mitterrand in France.
Yeah, that's right, Mitterrand in France. Although he's the one exception because France doesn't actually take the INF weapons, but still, he's standing with Reagan on a lot of other stuff. And all of them take tremendous political risk in supporting the American nuclear missile deployments because they believe in the policy in part, but also because they believe in Reagan. And they know that he has spent a lot of time listening to their concerns. He's made big concessions to them in other areas, such as lifting the pipeline sanctions. We don't have to get into that here. And so they really put their necks on the line. And all of them but one is successfully reelected. I want to say it's the Dutch prime minister. The Dutch government actually does fall over this, which shows that this was not just blowing smoke. But that is the real test of alliance strength, is when an ally is willing to take significant political risk, putting their own political future on the line because of a belief in the alliance with America and whoever the American president or leader is at the time.
So that's a good segue to the alliance thing, because I want to say this book has beautiful and amazing pictures in it. But one of the things that's striking is he's constantly meeting with his friends, his allies, right?
Yeah.
Most of the pictures are, many of them are him meeting with his interlocutors from other countries. And there's a lot in here on Reagan and allies I wonder if you could talk about that, because I think a lot of people, Reagan, they think, oh, the American cowboy doing whatever, the U.S. kind of unilateralism. But your book shows an incredible sensitivity to nurturing relations with allies. Maybe you could talk a little bit about Reagan's view and how that worked out and some of the examples.
Sure, yeah. And it really operates at two levels. One, as president, he believes deeply in the value of alliances for American strength and American power and American security. Okay, so irrespective of whoever the leaders are, right? So he's an allies guy, and some of this comes from his formative years as a young man during World War II, when the first Grand Alliance is created in some ways, and seeing how key that was to the Allied victory over Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. So it starts with a bedrock view of allies as great assets for the United States. But then for him, it also goes to the next level of investing deeply in the personal connections with individual allied leaders. And with one or two exceptions, who I'll come to, with the notable ones, you'll recognize this one. But these bear tremendous fruit, right? So Reagan becomes close personal friends with Margaret Thatcher. Plenty of frictions and differences, but still close personal friends. Yasuhiro Nakasone, the Japanese prime minister, probably Reagan's closest friend next to Thatcher among Allied leaders. Very deep, close friendship, and pays a lot of policy dividends. Brian Mulroney in Canada, Helmut Kohl in West Germany, and then Pope John Paul II as well. And they all share his general commitment to free markets and certainly his commitment to anti-communism. And then Mitterrand in France as well. Again, different worldview, different temperament from Reagan, but they forge a really close friendship. A remarkable intelligence cooperation, which we talked about a little bit earlier. The one exception, of course, is Pierre Trudeau, and Reagan tries to like him, and he just can't. The Canadian prime minister, and Reagan never tries to stab Trudeau in the back or anything like that. He values Canada as an ally, but he just finds Trudeau insufferable. And of course, Trudeau could not speak to Reagan as a peer. I mean, Trudeau is always lecturing Reagan in this very condescending way. Read the transcripts of their telephone calls or meetings. It's cringe-inducing because and so Reagan was not unhappy when Trudeau was defeated by Mulroney for re-election. So
you mentioned, and we've talked about this before, and I think it's one of the really interesting one of the many interesting things in this book is Reagan in East Asia, right? So obviously a lot of the action, most of the action at the end of the Cold War is in Europe, but we are right now in a moment now where East Asia is at the center. And the thing that I found really interesting was this kind of revitalization of the relationship with Japan, and then also sort of how to manage China in that context, which I thought was very interesting. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that and tell us.
Yeah, I will. And I'll preface it by saying that, well, overall, I argue for a lot of consistency in Reagan's policies across his 8 years, certainly in his overall, Soviet strategy. The two areas where I see an adaptation, even a reversal, if you want. One is more full-throated commitment to democracy promotion by 1982, after 1981, and then the other is coming around to forging an entente of sorts with China. So he comes into office very committed to supporting Taiwan, backing away from China after Nixon and Kissinger and Ford and Carter and Brzezinski had all spent about a decade embracing China and shunting Japan off the side and marginalizing Taiwan. And Reagan wants to really recalibrate that. He says, no, we have got to reassure Taiwan of our commitment. We need to lock in our arms sales there. And he's pretty skeptical of China. But by 82, as he's putting some measures in place, what becomes still the reigning, the third communique is still the reigning paradigm for our arms sales to Taiwan, Reagan is starting to see some value in the partnership with China and realizing, okay, I understand now why Nixon and Kissinger and Carter, saw this there. He doesn't come out and say I was too dismissive of that, but he realizes, no, China is it's important. And then he forges not a very close friendship, but a pretty good rapport with Deng Xiaoping. And it is translated into a lot of real policy cooperation, intelligence sharing. China becomes one of basically the key conduit for arming the Mujahideen, both in weapons and supply routes. China is really key for helping bottle up some 60 Soviet divisions in the Far East. And so this is where Reagan is playing more of the classic realpolitik game. Although even there, he's nudging China on some of the freedom stuff. When he meets with Deng Xiaoping, he'll give him lists of prisoners of conscience he wants to be released. He gives speeches in China, encouraging them to move towards market democracy, right? So he's not abandoning all of that. But here he's like, okay, we got to work with these guys for the time. So that would be like I said, another area where there's an adaptation. But yeah, I mean, he was in 82 when he's starting to plan for what becomes his first trip to Asia. He and his staff are saying they think the Reagan doctrine will be this embrace of Japan and a reposturing of the U.S. in Asia. So he really sees himself as a Pacific president and very Asia looking. Now, later the Reagan doctrine is applied, of course, in another context. But that shows that from the get-go, he's a former governor of California, right? He's been looking across the Pacific for eight previous years.
Yeah. So you mentioned something about the fundamental. The key concern with democratization and how this was debated. And of course, in the administration, there were many different people with many different views on this. And so if you could comment on what you found on that, and then in particular, and this is not always commented on, but this is a time when many American allies, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, go through their own democratization process. And so generally how Reagan's views of democratization, where they fit in his grand strategy, how they changed or didn't change, and then what was his thought in terms of democratization when it came to allies.
Yeah. And there's a few threads that come into this. The first is because Reagan conceives of the Cold War primarily as a battle of ideas, right, which happens to be a great power competition. He's initially focused on defeating the bad idea of Soviet communism, if you will, but he quickly realizes you also need to beat a bad idea with a better idea. You need to show a more positive alternative here. And so that's where he becomes really focused on enlarging the contours of the free world, supporting the promotion of open trade and free markets, economic freedom, but also supporting political freedom and democracy. So he wants to show, look, life is better living in the free world than it is under Soviet communism. So it starts with that component of the grand strategy in the Cold War and the battle of ideas. There's also some practical considerations. One is, remember, he and his team, when they come into office, are deeply traumatized by the 1979 revolutions in Iran and then in Nicaragua. Both cases where there'd previously been an American-friendly but kind of brutal autocrat who at least was anti-communist, who then is, ejected in a popular revolution and replaced with a Reagan, I think, rightly regarded a more dangerous revolutionary government, militant Islam in the case of Iran, and of course, communism in the case of Nicaragua, that is even worse for the United States. And so when he initially comes into office, the concern is no more Nicaraguas, no more Irans. And so let's support our authoritarian friends. But then he starts to realize these autocracies are pretty brittle. They're not enjoying popular support. They're more subject to the whims of individual leaders. And when Argentina invades the Falklands, that we can now see in hindsight is a big moment for him. Wait a minute, this is supposed to be this friendly military dictatorship, and now they're starting a war with our closest ally, and they're losing that war. And the general's drunk half the time. I can't even talk to him, right? And so a combination of the need for more moral consistency and realizing the brittleness of these authoritarian regimes. And meanwhile, as he starts seeing some of the popular protest movements for democracy, the student movements in South Korea, obviously what becomes the people power movement in the Philippines. So it's partly his reading the tides of history as well, seeing that these things are going along and thinking, all right, it's just better for American interest and American values if we align ourselves that way. So that also includes putting pressure on, like I said, some of these American allies to democratize and do it peacefully. Most of the credit for that has to go to the democracy activists themselves, but includes some key interventions, right? I mean, Reagan sends a number of envoys down to Chile in 85, 86, 87, telling Pinochet, your time is up. We're going to be withdrawing American support. You need to allow open and free elections. He has to do that very much for the Chun dictatorship in South Korea, too. And so signaling American support for the democracy activists and showing diminishing American support for the dictators is, I think, an important outside factor and an underappreciated part of the Reagan legacy.
So, lest we think that the book or this conversation is just one long love letter, I think the final question it's about Reagan and the foreign policy process, right? I mean, I think it would be a not unfair thing to say that is definitely not a murderer's row when it comes to national security advisor selections. It was a process that involved, I heard you talk earlier about the competing speeches that Schultz and Weinberger were giving. The Iran-Contra, when you kind of dig into it, it's almost more farce than tragedy in a lot of ways. Tell me, and what's interesting is when you think about we've had now, I mean, it's hard to think, when we've seen the administration you served in, which was very tight process oriented, the Obama administration very tightly organized. I mean, looking back now, I mean, it seems even messier than it did at the time. Like it just seems like it was all over the place. And so what did you come away? Why was it like, why couldn't he get a decent national security advisor? Why couldn't he put together a process that generated a consistent, unified, cohesive sort of voice speaking on behalf of the administration?
Yeah, so there's a few factors going on there, and I've spent several years researching this, writing about it, thinking about it, and I'm still puzzled with some of this. Okay, so I got to put it out there. So I'm not going to be able to give the magisterial answer, but rather just a few reflections. First, a partially benign reading. This is true. Is Reagan was generally committed to cabinet government. Okay, that's how he had practiced run things in California. He's pretty comfortable being a delegator. He wanted stronger cabinet secretaries. He didn't want really tight White House control. Okay, now most presidents say that in some respect or another, but he actually tried to put it in place, even to the point of started off demoting Dick Allen, the national security advisor, not even being a direct report to the president. Because he thought Kissinger had too much power before. So. But also, Reagan is conflict averse. He is very uncomfortable with personal disagreements, with people not getting along with each other. Some of this, is from being the child of an alcoholic. Some of it is from his more sunny disposition and just wanting to think the best about people. and he just does not pay attention to a lot of the details of management and organization. And when you look at times when he was achieving some policy success, it's usually when he had some sort of alter ego who was taking care of those details for him. So when he was governor of California, Bill Clark had been his chief of staff and was pretty organized. His first White House term, Jim Baker as chief of staff, still widely regarded, I think appropriately so, as the most effective White House chief of staff in history. And then I will give Bill Clark some credit due during his time as national security advisor of helping to run a better process. But even when the process was running pretty well, you've got a lot of strong opinions and egos involved. Schultz and Weinberger at DOD, and there's only so much that at DOD and state. There's only so much that the process can answer that, and Reagan just won't crack heads and just won't make just won't arbitrate these things. Even though many people would plead with him to pick him, pick me, just pick something. But at the end of the day, he still is able to achieve some strategic successes because the issues he really cared about, he would make those decisions, and eventually he de facto elevates George Shultz as first among equals, right? And the Shultz Reagan pairing, especially in the second term, is really powerful, to the detriment of Weinberger over at the Pentagon, to the frustration of Bud McFarlane and later John Poindexter, others who might be competing for the power centers. It's pretty clear that Reagan's decided, Shultz is going to be my main partner, and everyone else will be second fiddle.
So I can't, and as you know, we're very much in an era, and both our worlds are very much involved in the kind of applied history process, for better or worse. Final sort of comment: what lessons from this book and from the Reagan period and Reagan himself would you have for today? And how would Reagan view, you look at a world where Russia invades Ukraine, China is increasingly aggressive, seems to be some level of disorder. There's even some parallels to the kind of inflation and the sense of dislocation. What are there lessons you have as we think about contemporary and future grand strategy that you would?
Yeah, I've given a lot of thought to this, so I won't dodge the question. But again, I have to do the disclaimer. I don't touch any of this in the book because I just want the book to be a pure history. So readers, any listeners who want to read it, draw your own conclusions. Okay. That said, let's back a little bit. Rather than trying, and I know you weren't asking this, but rather than trying to take a specific roadmap from applying Reagan's NSDD 75. let's just take out Soviet Union and insert People's Republic of China. Not that. I'll talk about a few of his policy priorities and principles that I do think can be helpful to reinforce now, right? So allies is a big one. And again, I don't just mean this in a trite way. When you look at how deeply he invested in allies, the compromises he made for them, how he saw them as source of asymmetric strength, and also how he was able to control them to get them to do a lot more too, right? So that would be one. The values part is a big part, not just the confidence in American values, but realizing that these are also a unique attribute in American strategy that dictatorships just can't have and can't appeal to. And so his seeing political and human rights and religious dissidents, not just as humanitarian cases, but as almost assets in the overall struggle against totalitarianism. That's another one. The details and how of his defense modernization and build up, right? Again, looking for cost imposing strategies, looking for weapon systems that can, outpace the enemy, not just to deter use of force, but to be connected to the larger diplomatic goals. That would certainly be another one. Taking the battle of ideas seriously, including in information operations, right? So this is the golden age for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Voice of America. Reagan's given them more resources than they know what to do with. My colleague Mark Pomar at UT, who previously had helped run a lot of these operations, Coulter's wrote a great book on this. And in it, as he did the history of the radios, from their creation, he said the only two U.S. presidents who ever personally visited Voice of America were, this won't surprise you, Ronald Reagan and JFK. Right. So the two presidents who took the ideological dimension of the Cold War most seriously, I think, took the information aspect of it as well. And finally, I got to say, just on the economic front, and this is not popular these days, but Reagan battled tremendous protectionist headwinds among American domestic sentiment, among Democrats and Republicans, then as now. And he was a very committed free trader. It may not have always been the perfect policies, but he saw that not just as more economically efficient, but as a key glue for the alliances, as a key component of the free world that he was trying to build out, as a key concession the United States can make. And he was regularly making that case to the American people too. And I think, as we certainly look at, the trade disruptions we've seen in Asia and a lot of our Asian allies being frustrated with us on the trade front, they'd be a lot more willing to be more robust strategic partners for us in countering China if they felt like they had better trade ties too. So that's another part of the Reagan playbook. So anyway, there's some food for thought.
Excellent. Great stuff. And I think anyone who knows Will and I knows that we could continue this conversation for another 9 hours, which would then end this podcast and no one would ever listen to them ever again. So I'm going to show some rare self-discipline, but thank you, Will. This book is absolutely tremendous. I think that it really is going to become the standard work on Reagan's grand strategy and foreign policy for as long as I can imagine. An extraordinary amount of work put into it. Just a terrific piece of work. Great conversation. Thank you so much, Will.
Well, thank you very much. And everyone, the book is The Peacemaker, Ronald Reagan, the Cold War, and the World on the Brink. Available wherever you get your books.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.